Welcome to The Big Picture. I'm Phil Arno. Last week we had a conversation about genes and gene technology and how they influence your life and may influence your life in the future in terms of health and longevity. My guest today is Dr. Richard Gronostajski, who is professor of biochemistry and the director of genetics and genomics at the graduate program at the University of Buffalo. The conversation was very interesting last week. I think we got through 2 of our questions and I had 30 of them. So we're going to continue this discussion. The technology has advanced recently. It's kind of exploded into the world, and the understanding of how things work and genes and how they influence our health, the way we behave, the various aspects of our life. Genes are behind it all. And not just in humans, but in plants and animals as well. And many of our viewers have kind of a surface knowledge of genes and DNA. We all watch CSI and we all watch the news and hear about breakthroughs in gene technology and treatments for various diseases. But we don't have a very in-depth understanding of how all this works. Last week we talked about a lot of the technology that that's come about recently, and about ancestry studies that can be done, understanding your propensity to have various diseases, and we're better now than we were years ago in analyzing those things, but it's still not that accurate. We're still in the beginning stages of analyzing DNA, but we're making tremendous strides.
That's right, and so we're very good at, there are about 1,000 genes in that for which we know mutations will cause human diseases, and we're very good at predicting those diseases. But there are other diseases, things like Alzheimer's and things like diabetes and even some diseases of old age, where we don't think that it's a single gene that's affecting the process, but it's actually the interaction between maybe a half dozen to a dozen or more genes that influence your likelihood to go bald, or your likelihood to gain weight as you get older. And so we're really, as I say, there are many serious diseases that we understand the genetic nature of, but there are other diseases which we don't understand the nature of. And over the next 10 years, I think we are going to be able to predict with much greater accuracy your likelihood to suffer from, say, Alzheimer's disease, or to die prematurely from heart disease, for example. These are areas that there's a tremendous amount of research going on right now, and I'm confident that in 10 years, almost all of your viewers, for example, and myself, will have our entire DNA sequence measured, and it'll be part of our standard medical practice. That when we go to our doctors, they'll say, well, looking at these, the mutations that you have in specific genes, maybe we should start you on some medications to help prevent you from getting a particular disease, rather than just treating diseases after they've already show symptoms.
Okay, so I'm going to just answer one question here for the viewers who are curious. If they're thinking about getting the ancestry analysis, and some of those studies also give you the very cursory analysis of what diseases you may be subject to, and is it worth it today? And what will you get out of it if you go for one of those studies, very briefly?
Yeah, I think that if you're curious and you have an extra $100, $150, which is a sort of a standard, then I personally would recommend that you do it. I think that I'm a research scientist. I think that knowledge is better than ignorance. So if you get a little bit of knowledge and you don't get too worried about it, you don't get too wrapped up in, if they say you have a 5% higher likelihood of coming down with diabetes, well, you have a 95% chance of perhaps not getting diabetes. So you do have to look at your genetic information with an understanding that it's not going to tell you you're going to die tomorrow, or it's not going to tell you that you're going to definitely come down with this disease. What it will give you is likelihoods, increases in the probability that you may, for example, go bald, or increase in the probability that you may come down with a particular heart disease. But usually any genetic change is a very small difference. So I would recommend that you do it. If you're interested in ancestry things, you'll get that information. If you're the medical issues, though, I think particularly in New York State, New York State doesn't like practitioners to give medical information without having one-on-one consultations with patients. So the information that you get from these from the ancestry databases will not give you very much information on your medical conditions. You would have to actually work with your local physician if you wanted to have a specific genetic test.
Very generic, I should say.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, we touched on this very briefly before the show. I have twins, and there's some twins here in the studio working the crew. And the difference between identical twins and fraternal twins, environment on personality and on health versus genetics, there's two different influences. What's a stronger influence on how your life progresses?
Well, I think it very much depends on the type of disease that or the type of condition that you're talking about. So, for example, we know that there are diseases such as muscular dystrophy, which is a disease that is due to a specific which are due to mutations in a specific gene that is known. It's one of the first genetic diseases that was actually discovered as due to a mutation in a gene. And if you have mutations in that gene, you are going to suffer from muscular dystrophy. However, other genes or other genes in your body can influence when, for example, you might get a disease. So two individuals that have the same genetic mutation, some of them might come down with muscle weakness in their very early teens, and others it may not occur until their late 20s, for example.
But there's no environmental trigger for that.
There can be environmental triggers. The environment really interacts with the genes in your system to influence a lot of conditions. So you talked about personality, for example. There have been a number of genes that have been associated with autism, for example, but not everyone who has a mutation in that gene necessarily is autistic, because one gene can interact with another gene, much in the way ingredients can interact with each other when you make a meal. And so to get that particular flavor, you might have influences from a dozen different spices that go into a meal. And that's sort of the way that genes can function when it comes to specific diseases, that multiple genes can have an influence, and then, for example, how hot you make a plate when you're cooking it can influence it. So both the environment interacts with genes to influence a lot of behaviors and a lot of human characteristics.
Okay, I want to switch directions a little bit here. We've heard that, and I think I read an article just last week about some farmers in the Midwest that are having some crops modified so that they last longer and they don't spoil as quickly. The genes in the crops are altered, and they will last on the shelves a lot longer. When you modify fruits and vegetables through genetics to make them better, if you will, less likely to be affected by insects or mold or other things that make them spoil. Some people think that that's a very bad thing. They're very worried about taking something that's been genetically modified. And for some reason they think, well, I shouldn't consume something that's been genetically modified. Is that valid?
As human beings, we've been doing genetic modification actually for thousands of years. So if you look at individual breeds of dogs, all of the dogs that you see, from a Chihuahua to a Mastiff, originally were all wild dogs. And it was through years of selective breeding that we managed to isolate the genes that we wanted, that to make an animal look a certain way or to make a crop plant grow a certain way. It's just that it took generally dozens of years or hundreds of years sometimes to actually do this process. What we can do with genetic technology is we can study the process much more carefully. We can take a gene that we know will influence the process, and it might take 20 years to breed that specific mutation into a crop plant. Now we can do it in one generation, and we can make the plants either resistant to insecticides or resistant to spoilage. And so I think when you think about it, genetic engineering is a much more precise way of modifying things than just taking two crop plants and breeding them together and hoping to get something out the other end that's better, and then doing that hundreds of times to finally get a better. You're doing, to some extent, the same thing. You're working with genes that are in the population, but you're restricting them, you're isolating them into to make a better plant. And my personal feeling is that with most genetic modifications, that's what we're doing. We are taking genes not from far distant organisms, but usually very closely related organisms, and simply putting them in to make the crop plant a healthier plant. And so I think what most people are worried about are unintended consequences. That is, we never know with 100% certainty that something's going to work the way we think it's going to. And that's why I understand, my understanding, although I don't work for any agricultural businesses, is that they test these altered crops first on animals, then on volunteers, and make sure that there's nothing in them that causes anything like allergies, allergic responses, or any sort of response. You know, for example, that peanuts can cause severe allergies in some people. So I believe the peanut industry is trying to derive a peanut that is missing some of those allergens, so that more people can enjoy things like peanut butter and stuff. So it's
well, that's a good thing. We can hope for a better future in vegetables and fruits that last longer on the shelves. That's all for this segment, and we'll be back right after these messages with more of this interesting conversation. Stay tuned.